welcome everybody to today's radio show. Today's radio show is entitled Network as a Service, Transforming the Enterprise Marketplace. In today's radio show, we're going to be sharing with you some key research findings from an Omdia research project that was sponsored by Amdocs. And what we're going to be doing is providing some key takeaways from the research and just providing some insights into the adoption and the drivers for network as a service. So joining me today on today's radio show is Oren Marmer. Oren is the VP and head of NFV at Amdocs. So welcome, Oren.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be here.
So a little bit of background on the research project. So the research project that Omdia and Amdocs worked on together started in the fourth quarter of 2019. And it was really designed to provide a really all-inclusive or 360 view of the adoption of network as a service. And there were a number of deliverables, but the three real foundational deliverables were really three surveys. So we did a survey of service providers, we did a survey of vendors, we also did a survey of enterprise users. And really all these three surveys were foundational, that they really were designed to kind of give a view of the adoption drivers for network as a service. So what I'm going to be doing now is sharing with you three data points from the enterprise survey. So the first point I wanted to talk about from a network as a service perspective, and again, this is in an enterprise context, was really to understand how familiar enterprises were with the concept of network as a service. And you can see here, based on over the 250 enterprises we surveyed, you can see here that in terms of familiarity, there is quite a bit of familiarity on their part. You can see that 28% said that they were very familiar with the concept, 26% were extremely familiar, and 24% were actually currently using some form of a network as a service. So overall, you look at the bottom part of that, really only kind of 22% either weren't familiar or only somewhat familiar. So overall, I think this really does show that enterprises are very much engaged and really understand the concept of network as a service, and in fact, some of them are already using it. I guess, Oren, I'll bring you in here. You know, do you have sort of a sense that, you know, the familiarity of network as a service is really kind of tied to a number of different factors from the enterprises, that enterprises are, you know, they've been adopting cloud-based services. So in some respects, network as a service is kind of a natural evolution of cloud-based services?
I'm assuming there definitely has to be a correlation in between their familiarity and sort of adoption of network as a service and their strategy around cloud and digital services in general. You know, I must say that I'm actually quite surprised, pleasantly surprised by these results, when, you know, I would assume that the ratio of adoption or, you know, high level of familiarity would be lower. And the fact that we just in between the currently using and extremely familiar, which I'm assuming you're extremely familiar, you're one step closer or one step before actual adoption. You know, 50% of the enterprises, it's a fairly high ratio. So I think it definitely has to do with the fact that cloud-based services, combination of public cloud with private cloud, the entire concept of digital marketplaces and self-service portals and self-service capabilities is becoming much more prevalent. I think this is all leading to this familiarity and willingness to adopt network as a service.
Yeah, good point. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, sort of I think every year when I talk to service providers, vendors, even enterprise customers, just the pace of leveraging the cloud for new applications, it's growing at a really high rate. And I think you're absolutely right. This is kind of reflected in this research.
Exactly.
Okay, and the second area we kind of investigated with the enterprises was really to understand what are some of the benefits that they would see in terms of specific benefits that they would see in terms of adopting a network as a service model. And you can kind of see here, and this was a ranking. So we took these 9 or 10 different attributes and we asked them to rank them. And you can kind of see, based on the number one rankings, there was a number of things that stood out. The first one was it eliminates the need to design and build up the network, which makes a lot of sense because of the pace of cloud adoption. And then things like security. I mean, I cover security within heavy reading. And part of my area is to look at sort of the drivers, and, you know, almost in any sort of application in the cloud, security is always something that's kind of front and center. So it makes sense to me that 22% felt that the number one ranking was to be able to get kind of superior scale and feature support for security. And then, but either things like, CapEx reduction, skill shortages, seamless upgrades, all these things are important. So I guess, I expected managed services strength to be strong, but you can also see that there's kind of a number of different drivers here. And I guess, Oren, from your perspective, any sort of surprises from your perspective at all?
First of all, I'm not surprised that it's spread across a lot of different factors, because we know that when you talk about actual benefits, some of them are always related to operational aspects, security, pricing, and so on. So it's a mixture. I would be, I'm somewhat surprised that almost the number one, definitely if you look at the highest percentage on rank one, being the eliminates the need to design and build out the network, because we're talking about, I would have expected this to be, and we'll get to that in a second, the number one when we survey service providers. But here we're talking about enterprises, right? And typically when they get a service, whether it's a network as a service or whether they buy off fixed packages, they still typically don't design and build their own network. It's something the service provider does for them. So, it might be a matter of interpretation. I think that the fact that security is security, both in terms of scale and feature support and so on, is very high on the list is not surprising, as well as the CapEx. I think everyone is extremely concerned about CapEx, and the fact that if this can indeed lead to flexibility, both the reduction of the actual pricing of some of the key services, as well as the ability to sort of have a greater flexibility, agility, granularity, and you can optimize the service offering based on your needs, and through that be able to optimize the cost.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's move on to one more data point. Okay, and this final data point from again, this is an enterprise context. We asked the enterprises we surveyed how likely they would be to buy, configure, and self-provision a number of different services from a network service provider portal in terms of virtual network functions. And you can kind of see here, we asked them what they were currently using, what they were likely to use, what they were extremely likely to use, what they were very likely to use, and maybe somewhat likely and not likely. And you can see here things like, in terms of based on currently using, unified communication as a service was 24%, and then again, kind of aligned with the previous chart, managed security services 22%. But even things like managed LAN and data center interconnect and IoT management and cloud value services, they all rank pretty highly in terms of they're using some form of these services today. And in terms of, if you look at it, extremely likely, there's a number of things stand out again. In the 33%, the 30% managed LAN and data center interconnect are also up there pretty high. So I think this, to me, again, it kind of reaffirms that security is important, but obviously there are, collaboration services have always been important, and they'll continue to be important. And it's important that those services be available through a service portal. Also, I think it kind of reaffirms that things like data center interconnect and IoT, fundamentally are important services, as are any sort of cloud value-added services. I'm guessing, anything from your perspective here that stands out, Oren, in terms of either unified communication strength or data center interconnect and any sort of?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I would have guessed, although it's within the margin of error, that security would have been high on the list. But actually, when you look at it sort of as a broader picture, look, it's almost even, right? You have sort of a pretty even distribution. You definitely see, bandwidth on demand being last is probably not overly surprising. I think that most enterprises would be much more focused on the actual richness, right, and feature sets of services. And with the widespread of fiber deployment, I think today the actual bandwidth is becoming probably less of an issue, because you plan ahead, and it's not as if you change that dramatically. Maybe we'll touch on this later on. I might be a bit surprised by SD-WAN being so low on the list, because this is something that a lot of service providers a lot of enterprises are exposed to directly. And we are hearing through some of our customers that they have, our customers being service providers, that they have their enterprise customers approaching them and asking specifically for an SD-WAN based solution, or for SD-WAN solutions from specific vendors. So maybe that is only relevant to a subsegment of larger enterprises, and that might be reason for a lower percentage. But overall, I think we have here, a good coverage and almost like a good menu of all the different options we expect to see after these.
Yeah, and just to go back to your point about SD-WAN, if you look at the extremely likely, 31%, it was SD-WAN was second. So I mean, these are all pretty tightly packed in here.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're actually right. Now that I look at it, the extremely likely is almost. This is within probably the margin of error. Yeah. So the difference is in between the. I see that it's basically changing in between the currently using and the somewhat likely. So it's probably even stages of adoption and so on.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that kind of summarizes the enterprise view. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to look at network as a service and how it's perceived through the eyes of the vendors that we surveyed. Okay, so in this section, I'm going to be reviewing some of the key findings, really 3 data points from the vendors that we interviewed as part of this project. And again, the idea here was to give us kind of a 360 view of network as a service adoption from the enterprises that consume the services, the vendors that create some of the VNFs that they sell through the service providers, marketplaces, and portals. And so if we look at it from a vendor perspective, there's some really, I think, a couple of interesting findings. On this first question, what we really wanted to do was we really wanted to understand from a vendor perspective what challenges they felt that service providers or CSPs would have in monetizing VNFs and cloud-based services. And you can kind of see here we broke it down into major challenges, somewhat of a challenge, and not a challenge. And if you look at this, there's a number of, I think, kind of key takeaways. First of all, the range of major challenges, sort of 11% or less, which I think is a positive thing. But obviously, if you look at the range of challenge responses, it's pretty wide. It goes up to 63% in some cases. But if you look at it from really sort of, if you focus on just the challenge here, some of the things that stand out is the second bullet here was enterprises may choose virtualized services from cloud service providers like AWS or Azure over CSP supplied virtual network service. And that's obviously a real consideration in this world we live in, where services can be run in various clouds and available on kind of a global basis.
Right.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was just confirming and expressing my agreement.
Okay. And the other thing that's interesting here is, to me, is that the 59% for the CSPs lack self-service portals that let enterprises kind of choose and manage their own VNFs. And I think, if we go back just a second to the enterprise data points we just saw, we saw that enterprises are very, very much in tune or very much aware of network as a service and of being able to access services through portals. So I think it's an important part. It kind of reaffirms, in my view, that that certainly the vendors believe that they see that their customers, the CSPs in this case, have a number of challenges. One is just dealing with the kind of hyperscalers, which is a normal occurrence in the world we live in. But I think the other thing is, I think this second data point, this CSP self-service portal, kind of, I think, really to me highlights the value that CSPs can kind of can really implement to really help them address kind of competition.
I think that when we look at it, and first of all, I think we see a fairly optimistic view. And I remember when I read through these results for the first time, in terms of the dark red, the major challenge represents a major roadblock. There's barely any of these, right? So while there is a focus on certain challenges, it's mostly spread in between challenges that are manageable or just somewhat of a challenge. But I think that what we see here is the threat and we see the opportunity. So if we look at the first 2 items, that's, I think, one of the major threats that service providers are facing today. The fact that hyperscale providers or over-the-top players are basically riding over their network, creating greater value, moving a lot of the monetization into their angle, and basically creating greater customer stickiness. And whether it's enterprises that are building their own SD-WAN network and sort of bypassing the service providers altogether, or whether the fact that they just buy connectivity, which is the second bullet, right? But then buy different applications and functions directly, and that sort of turns the service providers into simple, or what we call dumb pipe providers. So that's definitely the threat. I think that the opportunity lies within what we see in the following bullet. So the fact that it's true, service providers lack service portals today, but this is where they can actually change the approach. They can enhance their offering. They can find an opportunity to shine, because I think, and this is what we're seeing through a lot of the projects that we're engaging with, and we have quite a few customers. Globe in the Philippines is just one example of an extremely large operator that is also highly innovative, and is part of the sort of NFE orchestration and automation project. One of the key objectives was to have a digital marketplace portal. So they realized that it's not enough just to automate the network and to virtualize and to expose all these functions. You need to go all the way and provide the customer experience as well, to allow their end customers, which are mostly enterprises, to order functions independently. And I think that this is where they can turn the threat into an opportunity, because if they do successfully transform themselves and they move higher up the stack, and now service providers will be able to bundle not just connectivity, but also all of these different VNFs and functions, and they can provide the digital experience and the right customer front end, then they have a true differentiation. Because at the end of the day, while there is the threat that is coming from the first two items, most enterprises would rather have a single throat to choke, right? And they would rather not start to slice and dice their network offering into so many different components and segments. So if a service provider is able to move higher up the value stack and to provide that entire range of offering, I think that a lot of prospective customers in the market would rather take a bundled offering and ensure that they not only order all the elements for one party, but they also have that end-to-end accountability and responsibility and quality of the service and adherence to SLA and so on.
Yeah, good points. And again, these research or these key findings are in the context of a vendor perspective. And I think you hit the nail right in the head that, even the vendors understand that the service providers, the future for them in a lot of respects is to be able to roll those services out in kind of a more seamless fashion. And that's something we're actually going to see on the next slide that's coming up. So this last data point that I'll be presenting from the vendor survey is really kind of forward looking. So it was basically structured to sort of provide an agree or disagree option. And really we can see here that just overall, like the range of agree options versus disagree are much higher. And one of the things that we really investigated in the research was to really understand sort of not only just the requirements for marketplaces, but how to evolve from a portal to a marketplace, but also what are some of the requirements to be able to for CSPs to be able to deliver these services, and as you said, or to be able to differentiate these services from the hyperscalers. And so when we asked a number of series of questions here, statements, we asked them if they agreed or disagreed. You can see that overall, and these statements were very much focused on the first one. I'm going to start from the bottom, the 95%, and that was, for CSPs to succeed in network as a service, they will need to support cross-domain VNF service onboarding. 95% said, yeah, that's something they're going to need to have. And if we work our way up here, you can see things like the second one, 86%, talking about they're going to need to automate service lifecycle management. They're going to have to, reduce service fulfillment time. They're going to have to improve customer experience. Other things like 84% said they're going to need to be able to support things like cross-domain orchestration for seamless delivery of VNFs. And then the final one was they're going to be able to need to support things like service chains, VNF from multiple vendors. Again, this is in a vendor context, but even the vendors really understand that CSPs need the flexibility to be able to onboard, to be able to support cross-domain orchestration, because it's going to allow them to be able to use flexible service bundles. So to me, the vendors really have I think a really handle on what they think their customers need to be successful.
So first of all, by the way, looking at these questions, I think you definitely passed the exam, right? You were able to draft the right questions if you have close to 90% of folks agreeing with the statements. I think that's really it's not surprising. It's encouraging. I think there's still a gap in the industry in between this agreement we're seeing here and the pace at which service providers are adopting this. But this is a separate challenge that we addressed in some other webinars we worked on together. But when you look at this, it sort of covers the entire range. So basically, I think we have a very strong, almost wall-to-wall agreement that you need to provide not just a sort of specific vendor siloed solutions, but you need to be able to offer multi-vendor ecosystem and be able to provide composite services that are service chained and combining different functionality. So this is sort of moving from a best of suite into a best of breed approach, where you want to provide your customers with the flexibility to pick and choose whichever functions they would like to have. Then the fact that we need to provide cross-domain orchestration. So it's not just the fact that we need to service chain and provide a multi-vendor ecosystem, but that these VNFs need to be orchestrated. And it's again, this is where I think there's a clear realization and support in the industry today that if we just virtualize functions and we don't change the way we design, onboard, orchestrate, fulfill, automate services, and so on, our benefits are going to be fairly limited. So this is where there's a clear understanding that there needs to be the proper level of orchestration and automation, because this is what ensures the required agility and flexibility, and the fact that when you address a new business customer, they can get a service in minutes and not have to wait for days or weeks. And then through the fact that it needs to address the entire life cycle management sort of range of services. So it's not just about delivering the service. This is where probably the third and fourth point are somewhat tied, but we need to start from how do we automate and simplify as much as possible the onboarding of new functions, because when we talk about service agility, it has to do with both the way to introduce, or how do we enable service providers to introduce new types of services much faster. Today it could take them 9 to 12 months. So how do we do that in a much faster pace, as well as how do we deliver those services to specific customers once they've ordered. And the last point, which I'm not surprised at all that we got to 95%, we do know that one of the main challenges in the past has been around lack of standardization and challenges around onboarding. So the fact that there's a strong need to onboard VNFs across different domains, across different functions is very clear. And I think for me, it's sort of that final piece in the puzzle that allows us to go all the way from new ideas, new market requirements, through fast innovation, fast new introduction of new services, and all the way through autonomous delivery of those services into specific customers.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's move on to one final data point. This one is in the context of the vendor's willingness to participate in a CSP and a hosted NFV marketplace. I think this is important because it kind of ties in some of these concepts that we've just discussed here. So on the final data point that we'll present from a vendor perspective, we just simply ask them, how likely is your company to participate in a service provider hosted NFV marketplace? You can kind of see here about 9% said they're already doing some sort of participation in a service provider marketplace. 14% said they'd be very likely. 47%, obviously more than almost half of the sample, said they'd be likely. And then you have sort of the unlikelies, very unlikely or don't know, kind of in the sort of I guess the 30% range. So I guess to me, this really kind of, we've already seen the enterprise perspective, we've seen some of the other vendor perspectives in the previous charts. This one to me kind of is a bit of a rationalization of the curve in a way, in that it says 47% said they're likely to do this, but only 9% are doing it today. So I think this kind of goes back, and you said, Oren, some of these numbers seem fairly optimistic. I think this one kind of brings us to a place of where we really are, And I think that there's really, even from a vendor perspective, there's definitely a value proposition around supporting service provider marketplaces because they provide the ability for them to compete better. But there's also, the reality is that there's a number of things that have to happen in terms of openness, cross-domain orchestration. All these things have to be kind of in place. And that came up in the previous chart. And I think that's why the likely number here, there's a fairly low number of very likely and already participating. So to me, again, this is kind of another I guess, factor that really shows that the vendors are looking at this and they would be willing to participate to help their CSP customers. But there's only been a small number of them are actually in CSP marketplace. And we're going to move on to the next section in a minute that talks about the CSP perspective of what they're implementing and why.
Right.
But I think this kind of, to me, kind of shows that, yeah, we're still, even though there's a lot of interest and the cloud adoption of services is really wrapping up year over year, that there still is a bit of a way to go here in terms of actually moving this from sort of the the concept, which is has a lot of strong support, to an actual commercial realization.
Right. Now, this is definitely a clear reality check. To some extent, although it's a different angle and a different, I think we could even say that there's a bit of a contradiction in between this and the first figure we started with from the enterprise perspective. And you remember when I said that, I was pleasantly surprised, but it seemed to me that a bit high of how many folks are already adopting. And if folks are adopting, then these functions need to exist. So maybe there's an optimistic view on one side and a more realistic view on the other side. As you said, I mean, the low percentage is not surprising in terms of already participating, but I think this is one of the key gaps. It's one of the most amazing opportunities that I think service providers have in order to address the challenges. And I think it's very much tied to the previous 4 questions we had in terms of the agree and disagree. It's not enough to just put the function in the portal if you don't have the proper orchestration, automation stack, service fulfillment stack, and so on, in order to really convert and service chain and tie these specific functions into services. So I think overall it makes sense. I'm not sure I understand why a vendor would say that it's highly unlikely or unlikely for them, because at the end of the day, it's just another channel. But maybe it's part of an evolution over time, and once they see a clearer benefit, they will start addressing it better.
Right, but to go back to the first point about the network, I think the first chart we showed from an enterprise was network as a service familiarity, and it was like 24% said they were using it. I guess it's a little bit of a different. Obviously, network as a service has many different faces or many different appearances, and here we're actually kind of looking at it in the context of a marketplace. So I think there's obviously some network as a service functions they can maybe purchase, but here we're actually talking about it in the context of a hosted marketplace, which is a little bit different. And I think that's probably one of the reasons I think that there is a difference between kind of the enterprise view and what the vendors are doing. Okay, in the final section, what we're going to do now is we've looked at it from an enterprise and from a vendor perspective. We're going to now move on and look at it from a service provider perspective. The actual service providers we surveyed, and their views on developing CSP marketplaces, supporting things like cross-domain orchestration, and it's really, I think, kind of interesting because it gets kind of close the feedback loop from the perspective of the service providers are actually trying to compete with hyperscalers and also monetize their cloud implementations. So in this section of the radio show, I'm going to be presenting 5 data points, and I chose 5 because there's 5 fairly strategic key areas that I think kind of, again, sort of close the loop in terms of the discussion. So the first point that I really wanted to kind of talk about was, again, the strategic value of network as a service. And we saw before in the enterprise that enterprises are very familiar with it. If we look at what the vendors thought, they think that vendors think that CSPs need some form of a network as a service strategy, and even things like marketplaces to be successful going forward. So when you look at this, it probably not too much of a surprise when we asked for them to rank network as a service from a strategic level. 34% said it was extremely important. 47% said that it's important but not the highest priority. And again, this 47% maybe kind of relates back to the one we just saw in the the vendor part that says that only about 9% were actually participating in CSPs marketplaces. So 47% think it's important, but not the highest. And 17 say it's somewhat important, or 2% said it's not. So, I mean, the good news is that, the somewhat important and not important, I mean, that's less than 20%. But I think, to me, I think this material, this really does kind of align, and it shows that, obviously service providers have a number of challenges in terms of as they continue on with their cloud transformation, not just monetization, but competition from new areas, but also just kind of making all this work and being able to migrate services, including enterprise services. I'm just wondering, any sort of surprises, Oren, from your perspective?
No, not really. I think on the bright side, the fact that the percentage of service providers that don't view this as highly important is low. I think that, obviously I would wish to see much more on the upper bracket, but I think that to some extent, and this is where, as you said, it's all tying in together. There is a bit of a chicken and the egg here, right? So in order to offer network as a service properly, and to offer portals and VNF stores and so on, you need to have the vendors supporting that. You need to have the proper, again, automation and orchestration stack. So I think it's all tying in together, and until you start making enough progress in each specific domain, it will be pretty challenging to tie all the pieces together. So, having a third, roughly, viewing this as a key component is already a great start. The ones that say that it's important, they understand the value, but it's not their highest priority, it might also mean that they understand that there are other elements that they need to deal with first and build and so on, in order to lay the proper foundation, and then they can deal with the actual introduction of this into the market. So I think overall it's an encouraging view in terms of the focus and the motivation.
Okay, agreed. And on the next chart, we're gonna talk about right coming up. I think it's also about, like you said, monetization and kind of tying things together. You have to build a cloud, you have to transform the services, and then you need to find a way to monetize that. And that's really what we asked them in the second data point. So in the second question that we asked them, we asked service providers how important some of the capabilities were to their overall network as a service monetization strategy. And you can see here, critical importance or critical component or an important component. If we look at kind of the critical components, 36% said it's about upselling existing value-added services, things even beyond connectivity, which probably isn't too much of a surprise given that's kind of what they're doing to monetize the cloud. They have to be able to upsell existing services, but also 30% see network as a service as a way to kind of break into new market verticals. Obviously, if they're a 5G operator, they've got connected car aspirations, consumer IoT, industrial IoT aspirations, and that kind of shows up there. And I think also, even someone will use network as a service for new digital content services, or to drive small groups, to drive professional services and consulting revenue. But I mean, to me, this is if you look at the critical component and the important component, it really shows to me that, first of all, in some respects, service providers are kind of taking care of business. They're looking to upsell their existing services portfolio, and again, that's probably one of the reasons why the enterprises in that first chart we showed are so familiar with network as a service, because the service providers are positioning network as a services to them, but a lot of them are kind of an upsell of their existing connectivity services. But this chart to me does clearly show that service providers do see kind of the long game here, and that they really need to be able to break into new markets. Even, in the important component, 56% said to launch new digital content services. So I think it really does show that, from a network as a service monetization strategy, there are a number of different paths that service providers can go. Again, just upselling is kind of maybe the low-hanging fruit strategy, but they also see the need to move into new markets. And one thing about this is, I always see there's a lot of interest in consumer IoT and industrial IoT. So I think I wasn't too surprised here, even though I think the actual real-time adoption is happening a little slower than we maybe thought a couple of years ago. There still is, to me, a strong pent-up demand for IoT services, and I think that's something that I think in the future will drive network as a service.
Right. No, I think that definitely, the upper category of value-added services is not surprising at all. I think that over time we'll see, even the 36% of critical growing, and it's definitely very consistent with what we see with all of our customers. So when we see customers that are engaging in their NFV journey and in a desire to introduce orchestration and automation, it's typically driven by two main business factors and KPIs. One is to introduce automation and to simplify operational complexities in the network. And the second is around generating new revenue sources. So how do they leverage that in order to have greater agility, ability to innovate faster, and to introduce numerous types of value-added services in order to move beyond just plain connectivity. So the first one is, I think, pretty straightforward. The new market verticals is definitely encouraging to see. I hope that would be the case. We've been discussing this for long, whether in the context of 5G, whether in the context of fixed networks, that service providers also need to not only move up but also move sideways in terms of expanding into additional applications and leveraging their network assets in order to offer these new types of services. And this is where, again, this entire concept of a marketplace, of quick onboarding of additional VNFs, of the ability to service chain them and to automate the entire service lifecycle management process is extremely critical.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's move on. We're gonna be now talking about some of the network as a service technical and operational limiting factors. So this chart is quite interesting to me. So we asked the service providers that we surveyed, in this case 97 of them, what are some of the technical and operational factors that were limiting their ability to optimize the efficiency of their network as a service deployments. And if we just go back, think about that previous one in the vendor data point, the 9% that were participating in a marketplace, you can kind of see here that the number one major challenge that the service providers see in terms of, as a sort of a barrier limiting their operational and technical adoption efficiency is VNF onboarding and integration. So to me, that's, interesting because it's kind of I would say one of the most fundamental things that the service providers need to be able to meet the needs of enterprise customers. And even a lot of the vendors in that previous chart that had the disagree-agree statements kind of view that it's important. But clearly, service providers are looking for a new approach here that's going to help them be able to sort of have seamless onboarding and integration. And that's, 29% say it's a major challenge, and 49% say it's a challenge. So that's, that's over it's over almost 70%. So I mean, to me, I think, and this is one data point in the entire report that we did, it kind of sort of bubbles through in a few instances in terms of the importance of seamless onboarding and integration, and cross-domain orchestration is obviously a part of that. I'm just thinking, to me, again, it kind of shows a fundamental area where there has to be some sort of development in the industry to open up onboarding and integration and cross-domain orchestration. Would you agree with that, Oren?
I would absolutely agree. I think this, when you look at the results, it's almost like it stands in a category of its own, right? It's the VNF onboarding integration and then all the rest. And this, if we had those agree and disagree questions with the vendors a couple of slides back, and that, if you remember, the last one at the bottom of onboarding and so on was 95%. So it was the most strong agreement. It's very much in line with this. So this is definitely one of the key challenges we see in the industry. I want to also emphasize that we're in a by far, orders of magnitude better state than we were 2 or 3 years ago. So 2 or 3 years ago, there was indeed lack of standardization, and we went through this as well. Of every new VNF or new function we had to onboard was quite challenging. I think the understanding that this is one of the key challenges in the market. Significant efforts around standardization by all standardization bodies, whether it's the Metro 834 or TMF or ETSI, as well as initiatives that we were, part of from the founding stage of such as ONAP, of creating an open source environment as a way to standardize and to align everyone on uniform VNF modeling and VNF packaging and interfaces and service modeling, this is already putting us in a much better state. So the service onboarding or the VNF onboarding is definitely not surprising. I think that when you look at the rest, with the exception of assurance that is smallish, I think this is mostly related to the fact that if you haven't really started going down the road of implementation, that you don't yet see the benefits. And then on the other hand, I think whoever starts seeing them pretty quickly. But the bottom three, I think, are all sort of around the same issue. And when you start introducing much greater choice and variety, it's great on the one hand, right? Because you now have more options and you could be more appealing and attractive to your customers. On the other hand, it adds a layer of complexity that needs to be managed. And this is something we're seeing as well, that if service providers in the past have been used to dealing with 1, 2, 3 vendors and bundle all the solutions from them, and all the commercial and legal and support aspects were pretty straightforward, if they now need to move into an ecosystem of dozens of different partners, sometimes this is not something they're used to support. And this is, by the way, we started seeing this as a clear requirement from some of our customers. We're even addressing this through a concept we started introducing, which is called the VNF marketplace. So in some cases, we realized that for service providers to deal with dozens of different vendors separately, it's much more challenging. If we or any other vendor, as part of the overall NFV and automation orchestration solution, provide a bundle, and we can sort of provide to them all the different solutions and licenses and manage the licenses and monitor usage and so on, it addresses some of those gaps. So I'm not surprised. I think it's definitely extremely consistent and reflective of what we see in the market. But there also, I want to sort of end with a positive note that there are ways to deal with this and to gradually address most of these challenges.
Okay, yeah, good points. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next data point now. So this next data point it's a little bit similar to the structure in terms of the vendor question that we just saw, and it's an agree, disagree. And it was really, what we really wanted to understand here was, we've already talked about sort of the value of onboarding, or the requirements for onboarding, and the value of cross-domain orchestration is kind of a key part of that to kind of provide that flexibility. So again, if you look at, when we ask service providers, if they agree or disagree with these statements, it was really to kind of take a sort of a level set, if you will, of where they felt that, cross-domain orchestration could provide some value. And you can kind of see that it really, if you go across and look at the agree statements, again, it's a strong percentage of the CSPs that we surveyed fall into the agree comments, agree area, 87% down to 68%. But the ones where I think to me it's kind of most prevalent is this notion that cross-domain orchestration provides a 5G, helps them execute their 5G edge services, kind of provides them a sort of a way to move that strategy forward ahead. It also provides greater flexibility in vendor selection, which I think is important in terms of flexibility. It also simplifies introduction of new services, and if you recall, and also helps them improve verticals, market positioning to sell at other verticals. And those 2 points, other market verticals and new services, we saw those in the vendor one as well, where they said that they wanted to be able to leverage, network as a service to move into new markets. And even the service provider said that they need to be able to upsell existing services, but also ultimately move into new services and move into new verticals as well. So this, to me, it kind of closes the feedback loop in that it kind of ties some of the value of cross-domain orchestration as kind of enabling them to kind of, create a strategy that's going to allow them to sort of execute and monetize their cloud deployments. Any surprises here, Oren?
No, by the way, as opposed to the previous agree or disagree question or set of questions, at least here we see some variance, right? So the 5G is not surprising at all. I remember when we started looking and researching and starting to build our 5G strategy, it was very clear that as opposed to the existing network, even if you look at the mobile network, 4G started with physical elements and only later became virtualized, and 5G is the first network that will be fully virtualized from the onset. and B, it is targeted to provide not just connectivity and higher bandwidth, but exactly to provide lower latency and new market verticals and the ability to offer edge services and so on. And when you look at this, the level of complexity becomes so significant. And the fact that you want to not just sell connectivity, but you want to and edge especially is targeted at offering a wide range of applications. That necessitates the need to have the proper level of automation orchestration. So I'm not at all surprised that this comes in at first. Second is also not surprising. I think cross-domain orchestration is all about having vendor choice and avoiding the lock-in into one specific vendor. And even if I look at the bottom of the chart, the one that is sort of has the least support, it's still 68%, but there are 32% that disagree of reducing cost of cloud services. I think that the vendor community has as a way, at the end of the day, you shift costs around. So I don't think that cloud services by themselves will allow to dramatically reduce costs. The benefits will have to come from an overall much more efficient operational framework and so on. But I think that whether the introduction of cloud services will now directly go down in cost as a result of this is probably indeed questionable, and I think it highly depends on the specific circumstances.
Yeah, good point. Maybe just a point about that last one about the cost of cloud services. I would have been one of those ones that would agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Because I think maybe the cost structure that service providers have today may not go down. I don't disagree with that, but I think service providers kind of realize that where they're going to be 5 years from now with IoT in terms of just the massive amount of scale they're going to need in their networks. I think the hope is that they'll be able to deliver that increased scale at a lower cost than they could ever do without kind of a fully integrated and open cloud structure. I think that's why the agreement's here, because I talk to service providers and they still see, it's not going to maybe save us money today, but 3-4 years down the road, we wouldn't be able to afford to scale these services and provide competitive prices for them without losing them to hyperscalers. So I think that's what's at play here.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, let's move on to the final data point from the CSP survey. So in this final one, we've already talked about cross-domain orchestration on the previous charts. We really wanted to understand where service providers were in sort of the implementation of cross-domain orchestration, because it is so foundational to monetization and providing and meeting the needs of their enterprise customers. You can kind of see here when we asked them where they were in terms of implementation strategy, 22% said they'd already support this capability in their networks. And just to put things in perspective here, we didn't ask them if it was fully implemented. We really wanted to understand if there was some capability in their network, and 22% are saying that. And obviously, this doesn't suggest that every node of the network has this capability, but clearly, I think it shows that, and it kind of aligns with some of what the previous charts that we saw, that they are looking to monetize and move into new market verticals, and for some of those, they're going to need this ability to support cross-domain orchestration. And I think about 22 or 23% more than that said they wanted to move into new verticals. So there's probably a linkage here as well. So I think the good news is that some service providers have some part of this capability in the network today. Another 21% said that they're kind of implementing something that would give them that capability. And then there's always these 12 to 18 month window, 34%. And interesting enough, 21% said they would like to, but that there's still a kind of concern of a lack of a viable solution makes it difficult. And I think that kind of goes back to the, sort of the onboarding. And I think that's why their concern, the onboarding concern came up in the previous chart that said it's one of the operational challenges they face. So I think overall it shows kind of a pretty pragmatic view of where we are with cross-domain orchestration, that there are definitely some progressive service providers looking at this, have already implemented something, more moving to that right now, and kind of in the next 12 to 18 months, more than a third expect they'll get there. And 21% are kind of grappling a little bit in terms of, addressing that major challenge that we saw before about onboarding. So, I think to me, it shows that there is definitely